The December wind howled through Ogden, Utah like a wounded beast, and Lorelei Andrews stood on the auction platform in a dress that had been her Sunday best 3 years ago when her husband was still alive. She could feel every eye on her, some pitying, most calculating, as the auctioneer's voice cut through the bitter cold. Her breath came out in white puffs, and she wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the freezing temperature. The year was 1876, and women in her position had few choices. The bank had taken her homestead 2 weeks ago. Every penny her late husband Thomas had left her going to settle debts she never knew existed. The town council, in what they called mercy, had arranged this auction. She would not be sold as property, they insisted, but rather her future husband would pay her debts in exchange for her hand in marriage. The distinction felt meaningless as she stood there like livestock at market. "Gentlemen, we'll start the bidding at $100, the auctioneer called out. His name was Herbert Simmons, and he would not meet her eyes. She had known him since childhood, had brought his wife soup when she was ill last spring. Now he was selling her future to the highest bidder. A rancher named Buck Holloway raised his hand first. 100. He was 60 if he was a day, with 3 grown sons and a reputation for working his ranch hands until they dropped. Lorelei felt her stomach turn. 125, called another voice. Samuel Fletcher, the mercantile owner. He had buried 2 wives already, both dead before 30 from exhaustion and childbirth. The bidding climbed slowly. 150, 175, 200. Each increase felt like another nail in the coffin of whatever life she might have hoped for. The crowd was thin. Most folks huddled inside against the brutal cold, but those who had come were the ones with money to spare or desperation to match her own. She let her gaze drift over the assembled men, trying not to see the future in their faces. Then her eyes caught on someone standing apart from the main group. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate sparingly. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark hair curling at his collar and a jaw that looked carved from granite. He wore a heavy coat that had seen better days, and his boots were scuffed with hard travel. Something about the way he stood, perfectly still while everyone else shifted and muttered, made her heart skip. $250, Samuel Fletcher said, his voice carrying a note of finality. It was more than most would pay, more than her debts required. The crowd fell silent. Herbert Simmons raised his gavel. 250, going once. The stranger moved then, stepping forward with a purposeful stride that parted the small crowd like Moses at the Red Sea. $500, he said, his voice deep and rough as gravel. A collective gasp went through the gathering. Lorelei felt her knees weaken. $500 was a fortune. It was more than her homestead had been worth. It was more than most men in Ogden saw in 2 years. Samuel Fletcher turned, his face reddening. "Now see here, who are you to come in here and $500? The stranger repeated, louder this time. "Cash money. I can pay it right now." Herbert looked uncertain, glancing between Fletcher and the newcomer. "Sir, I'll need to see proof you have such funds." Without hesitation, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He opened it and poured the contents onto the barrel beside him. Gold coins spilled out, glinting even in the weak December sunlight. The crowd pressed closer, murmuring in astonishment. "That's more than 500, someone whispered. "Who is he? Never seen him before in my life." Herbert cleared his throat. "Well then, do I hear 525? Silence." Samuel Fletcher stared at the gold with naked longing, but even he would not go higher. Buck Holloway had already turned away, shaking his head. 500 going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed off the buildings. "Sold to the gentleman in the black coat." "Sir, "Your name for the record, Quinlan Winters," the man said. He was already scooping the coins back into his pouch, counting them out. "I will pay Mrs. Andrews' debts directly to those she owes. I want receipts for every penny." Of course," Herbert said, suddenly obsequious in the face of so much money. "Mrs. Andrews, if you'll come down, we can finalize the arrangement." Lorelei's legs moved automatically, carrying her down the 3 wooden steps. The platform had been erected specifically for this purpose, and she wondered distantly how many other desperate women had stood where she just stood. Quinlan Winters had not looked at her directly yet. He was busy with Herbert and the 2 bank representatives who had materialized the moment the gold appeared. She stood to the side, forgotten for the moment, and tried to reconcile what had just happened. This stranger had paid a fortune for her. Why? What did he want? What did he expect? The questions rattled in her mind like stones in a tin can. The transaction took nearly half an hour. Quinlan Winters was meticulous, demanding documentation for every debt, every claim against her. When the bank representative tried to add interest that had not been previously mentioned, Quinlan's voice dropped to a tone so cold it made the December wind seem warm by comparison. "The agreed-upon sum was $347. That is what I will pay, not a penny more." The banker backed down immediately. When it was finally done, when every debt had been satisfied and every paper signed, Quinlan turned to her at last. His eyes were gray, she saw now, the color of storm clouds. There were lines at the corners, etched by sun and hardship, and a scar through his left eyebrow that gave him a perpetually questioning look. "Mrs. Andrews," he said, and pulled his hat from his head respectfully. "I know this is not how anyone dreams their life will go. I know you do not know me, and you have no reason to trust me. But I give you my word as a man of honor that I will provide for you and protect you, and I will never raise my hand to you in anger." His words were formal, almost stiff, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost vulnerable. Lorelei found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Why? Why what, madam? Why did you pay so much? Why me? You do not know me either." A muscle worked in his jaw. Around them, the crowd was dispersing, disappointed that there would be no more spectacle. Herbert Simmons was packing up his papers, pointedly not looking their way. "Can we go somewhere warm to talk?" Quinlan asked. "You are shivering." She was. She had not noticed until he mentioned it, but now she could not stop. The cold had seeped into her bones during her time on the platform, and her thin dress and shawl were wholly inadequate. Without waiting for an answer, Quinlan shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders. It smelled of leather and wood smoke and something else, something that was simply him. The warmth of it was immediate and overwhelming. She pulled it closer instinctively. "There is a hotel dining room across the street," he said. "Will you take coffee with me, a meal?" "You look like you have not eaten today." She had not. She had been too nervous, her stomach in knots since dawn. Now that he mentioned it, she felt hollow and light-headed. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." He offered his arm, a gesture so courtly it seemed out of place in this rough town, but she took it. His arm was solid beneath her hand, all muscle and strength. He guided her across the frozen mud of the main street to the Ogden Hotel, one of the nicer establishments in town. She had never been inside. It was far too expensive for a widow scraping by. The warmth inside was glorious. A large stove in the corner pumped heat into the room, and the smell of coffee and fresh bread made her stomach clench with hunger. Quinlan led her to a table in the corner, away from the curious stares of the other diners, and held her chair for her. When he sat across from her, he looked uncomfortable, as if he were unused to polite society. He kept his hands on the table, flat and still, and she noticed they were scarred and calloused from hard work. A waitress appeared, a girl named Penny whom Lorelei knew from church. Penny's eyes were wide with curiosity, but she kept her voice professional. "What can I get for you folks?" "2 coffees, please," Quinlan said, "and whatever is hot for lunch, 2 plates. We have beef stew today and fresh bread." "That will be fine." When Penny hurried away, an awkward silence fell between them. Lorelei kept his coat wrapped around her shoulders, reluctant to give up its warmth. Quinlan stared at his hands. "I should answer your question," he said finally. "You asked why." "Yes." He took a deep breath. "I came to Ogden looking for work. I am a horse breeder by trade, and I heard there was a ranch outside town that might be hiring. When I arrived 3 days ago, I learned the ranch had been sold and the new owner brought his own men. I was in the mercantile, trying to decide whether to move on or stay and look for other work, when I heard some men talking. They were laughing about the auction today. About you." His jaw tightened, and she saw a flash of anger in his eyes. "They said things no man should say about a woman. They talked about you like you were a thing to be used. One of them was that rancher, Holloway. He was bragging about what he would do if he won the bidding." "I will not repeat his words in your presence." Lorelei felt sick. She had seen the way Buck Holloway looked at her, but hearing this confirmation made it real in a horrible way. "I spent the last 3 days selling everything I owned," Quinlan continued. "My horses, my tack, my saddle. Everything except the clothes on my back and my father's pocket watch. I barely got enough, but I knew I could not let those men have you." She stared at him, stunned. "You sold everything, for me, but you do not even know me." "No," he agreed. "But I knew I could not stand by and let that happen to another human being. My mother died when I was 12. My father raised me and my sister alone. He taught me that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who cannot protect themselves. You needed help. I could give it." Tears burned in her eyes. In the months since Thomas had died, since the debts had been revealed and the homestead lost, no one had helped her. The church ladies had clucked their tongues sympathetically but offered nothing. The bank had been merciless. Even friends, she thought she had disappeared when it became clear she had nothing left. And this stranger, this man she had never seen before, had given up everything to save her from a fate she did not want to name. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not have to say anything." Penny returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, and Quinlan wrapped his hands around his as if the warmth was a lifeline. "I want you to understand something, though. I said vows today in a way. I took responsibility for you. But I do not expect you to be a wife to me in anything but name, not unless you choose it. I will not force myself on you. When we leave here, I will take you somewhere safe, somewhere warm. You will have food and a roof over your head and time to heal from what you have been through. That is all I ask, that you let me help you." The tears spilled over then, running hot down her cold cheeks. She tried to wipe them away, embarrassed, but they kept coming. "Why are you being so kind?" Something shifted in his expression, something painful. "Because no one was kind to my sister when she needed it most, and because it is the right thing to do." Before she could ask what he meant about his sister, Penny returned with 2 bowls of stew and a basket of bread still warm from the oven. The smell was intoxicating. Lorelei could not remember the last time she had eaten a hot meal she did not have to cook herself. "Eat," Quinlan said gently. "We can talk more after." She did not need to be told twice. The stew was rich and hearty, full of tender beef and vegetables. The bread was soft and slathered with butter. She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some dignity, but hunger won out. She finished the entire bowl and 2 pieces of bread before she finally sat back, sated for the first time in weeks. Quinlan had eaten as well, but she noticed he watched her more than his own food, as if making sure she had enough. When they were both finished, he ordered 2 slices of apple pie and more coffee. It was a luxury she had not allowed herself in months. "Where will we go?" she asked as they ate the pie. It was tart and sweet, the perfect balance. "I have a place," he said. "It is about 2 days' ride from here, up in the mountains. A cabin I built myself 5 years ago. It is not much, but it is sturdy and warm, and there is good hunting and a stream that does not freeze even in winter." 2 days' ride, she repeated. "In December. I have a wagon and supplies. We will go slow, stop when we need to. There is an inn halfway that we can use if the weather turns bad." "You have a wagon. I thought you said you sold everything." A faint smile touched his lips, the first she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less severe. "I said I sold everything to raise the money for the auction. I spent what was left on supplies for the journey home. A wagon, 2 horses, food, blankets. I planned ahead." Despite everything, she found herself almost smiling back. "You were very certain you would win the bidding." "I was certain I would do whatever it took." The simple statement, delivered without boast or pride, touched something deep in her chest. This man was like no one she had ever met. Thomas had been kind, but he had also been weak in ways that had led to their current situation. He had borrowed money he could not repay, made promises he could not keep, and left her to face the consequences alone. She had loved him, but she had also resented him for dying and leaving her in such dire straits. Quinlan Winters, on the other hand, seemed like a man who kept his promises, who did what he said he would do. It was a rare quality, and she found herself hoping desperately that her first impression was accurate. "What about your sister?" she asked. "You mentioned her earlier. Where is she now?" The lightness left his face immediately. His hand tightened around his coffee mug. "She died 4 years ago. She was 23. I am so sorry. She married a man who seemed respectable. He had money, a good name in the community. My father and I did not like him, but Sarah was in love and we wanted her to be happy. We gave our blessing." He paused, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. "He beat her, regularly, severely. By the time we found out, she was too frightened to leave. She said he would kill her if she tried." Lorelei reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with hers. His skin was warm from the coffee mug, and he looked up at her in surprise. "My father and I went to the sheriff," he continued, his voice flat now, emotionless. "We were told it was a husband's right to discipline his wife. We went to the preacher. He said Sarah must be more obedient, more dutiful. We tried to take her anyway, to bring her home by force if necessary, but her husband had money and influence. He had us arrested for trespassing." "That is not right," Lorelei said fiercely. "None of that is right." "No, it is not. We were in jail for 3 days. When we got out, we went straight to her house. We found her at the bottom of the stairs. Her husband said she fell. The bruises on her face and arms said otherwise. But again, he had money and influence, and we were just a rancher and his son. No charges were ever filed." "What happened to him?" "The husband," Quinlan's eyes met hers, and there was something dark and dangerous in them. "He had an accident 6 months later, fell from his horse and broke his neck. Some might say it was justice. Others might wonder if someone tampered with his saddle. Did someone? I was working a cattle drive 200 miles away when it happened. I have witnesses who will swear to it." The implication was clear. Quinlan might not have been there, but he knew who was. His father, perhaps, or someone else who loved Sarah and wanted vengeance. Lorelei should have been shocked, should have been frightened of this man who casually spoke of murder. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. Here was someone who protected those he loved, who stood up against injustice even when the law would not. "I do not judge you," she said quietly. "Or your father. or whoever else might have been involved. I am not asking for your judgment. I am just telling you the truth of who I am. I am a man who has lived hard and sometimes outside the law. I have done things I am not proud of. But I have never hurt someone who did not deserve it, and I have never broken my word once given. I believe you." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine if she was sincere. Whatever he saw in her face must have satisfied him, because he nodded and pulled his hand back, though she noticed he did so slowly, almost reluctantly. "We should gather your things," he said. "If you have anything to collect, we can do that now. I want to be on the road within the hour." "I do not like the look of those clouds." Lorelei followed his gaze out the window. The sky had darkened while they ate, heavy gray clouds rolling in from the north. "There is nothing to gather," she said. "Everything I owned was sold to pay debts. I have what I am wearing, and that is all." His expression darkened. "They took everything, everything." He muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. Then he stood, dropping coins on the table for their meal. "Come with me." She followed him out of the hotel, back into the cold. He led her down the street to the Mercantile, the same one where Samuel Fletcher had been bidding on her less than an hour ago. The man himself stood behind the counter, his expression souring when he saw them enter. "We are closed," Fletcher said. "Your sign says you are open until 5 o'clock, Quinlan replied calmly. "It is not yet 3. I do not want your business. That is unfortunate, because I am going to give it to you anyway." Quinlan moved through the store with purpose, selecting items and piling them on the counter. A heavy wool dress in deep blue, a coat lined with fur, sturdy boots, thick stockings, a nightgown, undergarments, a brush and comb, soap, a bonnet, gloves. He did not ask Lorelei her sizes or preferences, but somehow everything he chose looked about right. Fletcher watched with narrowed eyes. "That will be $47. That is robbery and you know it. 30 and you should be ashamed for trying to cheat me. 35. 30 or I will go to the general store down the street and you will get nothing." Fletcher's jaw worked, but finally he nodded. 30. Quinlan counted out the money and turned to Lorelei. "Is there anything else you need?" She looked at the pile of goods on the counter, more than she had owned in the last year combined. "This is too much," she whispered. "You have already spent so much. You need clothes. You need to be warm. This is not negotiable." His tone was firm but not unkind. "Now, is there anything else?" She thought of the long journey ahead, the cold nights. "Perhaps some tea, if it is not too expensive." He added a tin of tea to the pile and a small pot to brew it in. Fletcher wrapped everything in brown paper and string, still scowling. As they left the store, Lorelei carrying the bundle, she felt overwhelmed. This morning she had been alone and destitute, facing a future of servitude to a cruel master. Now she had warm clothes, a full stomach, and a protector who asked nothing of her. It felt like a dream, and she was half afraid she would wake up. The wagon was waiting outside the livery stable. It was a sturdy vehicle, clearly built for rough travel, with a canvas cover to protect against weather. 2 horses stood in the traces, both strong and healthy-looking. In the back of the wagon, she could see supplies, blankets, a trunk. Quinlan helped her up onto the seat, his hands gentle but strong. Then he climbed up beside her and took the reins. Ready, was she? Ready to leave Ogden, the only town she had known since her marriage. Ready to ride off into the mountains with a stranger, trusting that his intentions were honorable. The sensible part of her said it was madness, but the sensible part had gotten her auctioned off like cattle. Sometimes, perhaps, madness was the better choice. "I am ready," she said. He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward. As they rolled through the streets of Ogden, people stopped to stare. She saw Penny from the hotel waving. Mrs. Henderson from the church with her mouth hanging open. The banker who had taken her home, looking like he had swallowed something sour. Let them stare. She was leaving this place, these people who had watched her suffer and done nothing to help. She was going somewhere new, with someone who had proven through actions, not words, that he would protect her. The road out of town led north and east, into the foothills of the mountains. The temperature dropped as they climbed, and Lorelei was grateful for Quinlan's coat, which she still wore. He had put on a different one from the back of the wagon, not as heavy but serviceable. They rode in silence for the first hour. Lorelei watched the landscape change around them, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills, then steeper inclines. Pine trees appeared, their branches heavy with snow. The road, such as it was, became rougher, and she had to hold onto the seat to keep from being jostled too badly. "Tell me about yourself," Quinlan said eventually, "if you want to." She considered what to say, how much to reveal, but he had been honest with her, brutally so. She could do no less. "I was born in Ohio," she began. "My father was a farmer. I had 3 brothers, all older. When I was 18, my father died and my brothers divided the farm between them. There was nothing left for me, and I was considered too much of a burden. My oldest brother found Thomas, a man looking for a wife to bring west. He paid my passage, and we married the day I arrived in Utah. Did you love him? No, I did not know him, but he was kind, and I tried to be a good wife. I learned to love him over time in a way. He was not a bad man, just an unlucky one. He borrowed money to expand the homestead, but the crops failed 2 years running. Then he got sick, some fever he could not shake. He died in September, and I discovered the extent of the debts only after he was gone. You could not have paid them. I tried. I sold everything we had except the land and the house. It was not enough. The bank said they would give me until spring to come up with the rest, but I had no way to earn that kind of money. Then the town council decided that the most merciful solution was to find me a new husband who could settle the debts." "Merciful," Quinlan repeated, his tone acidic. "What a generous word for selling a woman to the highest bidder." "I am glad you were there," she said quietly. "I am glad it was you." He glanced at her, something warm flickering in his gray eyes. "So am I." They rode on as the afternoon light faded. The clouds that had threatened earlier began to spit snow, small flakes that melted as soon as they hit the ground. Quinlan urged the horses to a faster pace, clearly trying to cover as much ground as possible before the weather worsened. As the sun set, casting the world in shades of gold and pink despite the clouds, they came to a small clearing beside a frozen stream. Quinlan pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. "We will camp here tonight," he said. "There is an inn about 4 hours further on, but I do not want to push the horses in the dark with a storm coming. Is that all right with you?" "Of course." She had slept in far worse conditions than a covered wagon. He jumped down and came around to help her. His hands on her waist were warm even through the layers of clothing, and he lifted her down as easily as if she weighed nothing. "There is a tent in the back, and plenty of blankets. I will set up camp and get a fire going. You should change into your new dress, something warmer than what you are wearing." She nodded and climbed into the back of the wagon while he began unloading supplies. The space was cramped but organized. She found the bundle from the mercantile and unwrapped it, pulling out the wool dress. It was beautiful, far nicer than anything she had worn in years, with a high collar and fitted waist. There were even petticoats included and a warm chemise. She changed quickly, her fingers fumbling with cold on the buttons. The new clothes were heavy and warm, and she felt immediately better. She pulled on the thick stockings and new boots, which fit perfectly. How had he known her size? She supposed he had spent his life judging horses and livestock. Perhaps gauging a woman's measurements was not so different. When she climbed out of the wagon, Quinlan had a fire going and a tent erected beside it. The tent was larger than she expected, tall enough to stand in, with a floor of canvas to keep out the cold ground. He had spread blankets inside and set up a small folding cot. "You will sleep in the tent," he said. "I will sleep in the wagon." "You do not have to do that. You could sleep in the tent and I could take the wagon." "No." His tone left no room for argument. "You will be warmer and more comfortable in the tent, and I will sleep better knowing you are safe." She wanted to argue, but the truth was she was exhausted. The events of the day, the emotional turmoil, the journey, all of it pressed down on her like a physical weight. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded and turned his attention to cooking. He had a small pot which he filled with water from the stream, breaking through a thin layer of ice to reach the liquid below. He added dried meat and vegetables, some herbs, and set it over the fire to simmer. The smell made her mouth water even though she had eaten only hours before. While the stew cooked, Quinlan tended to the horses, unhitching them and leading them to where they could drink from the stream. He brushed them down and checked their hooves, working with an easy competence that spoke of years of experience. The animals clearly trusted him, nuzzling at his pockets for treats. Lorelei sat by the fire, soaking in its warmth, and watched him. He moved with an economy of motion, never wasting energy, always purposeful. There was something hypnotic about it. When he finally returned to the fire, the stew was ready. He served her first, filling a tin bowl and handing it to her with a spoon. Then he filled his own and sat across the fire from her. They ate in companionable silence, and she marveled at how comfortable she felt. She should be terrified, alone in the wilderness with a strange man. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. After they ate, he made tea in the little pot he had bought. It was strong and sweet, and she wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring both the warmth and the taste. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "What do you plan to do now? You said you sold everything to win the auction. How will you live?" He stared into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "I still have my skills. I can breed and train horses, work cattle, hunt. The cabin has a good piece of land attached, enough for a garden and some livestock. We will not be rich, but we will not starve either. Come spring, I can hire out to ranches in the area. There is always work for a man who knows horses. And what about me? What will I do?" He looked at her then, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "Whatever you want. If you want to work beside me, I will teach you what I know. If you want to tend the house and garden, that is fine too. If you want to learn to read or write or anything else, I will help you. You are not my servant, Lorelei. You are not my property. You are a person who deserves to choose her own path." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice did something strange to her insides. "I can read and write," she said softly. "My mother taught me before she died, but thank you for offering. Then you can teach me to read better. I know my letters, but I am not good with books. You want me to teach you? I think we can teach each other many things." He stood and began cleaning up the dishes, using snow to scour them clean. "You should get some rest. We have another long day tomorrow." She helped him pack everything away, then retreated to the tent. Inside, it was dim but not completely dark. The firelight filtered through the canvas, casting wavering shadows. She removed the heavy dress and boots but kept the chemise and stockings on for warmth. The blankets on the cot were thick wool, and when she crawled beneath them, she found a hot stone wrapped in cloth that Quinlan must have placed there to warm the bed. The small kindness brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back and burrowed deeper into the blankets, listening to the sounds of Quinlan settling in the wagon, the horses moving nearby, the wind beginning to pick up. Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come immediately. Her mind raced with everything that had happened. This morning she had woken in the room she had rented with the last of her money, certain that her life was effectively over. Tonight she lay in a warm tent, her stomach full, her body clothed in wool, protected by a man who seemed to be everything good and honorable. It was too much to process, too overwhelming. So instead of trying, she let herself drift, focusing on the sound of the wind and the crackle of the fire outside. Eventually, mercifully, sleep claimed her. She woke to the sound of someone moving outside the tent. Panic seized her for a moment before she remembered where she was, who she was with. Pale light filtered through the canvas, the gray light of early morning. She could smell coffee and something cooking. She dressed quickly in the warm clothes, finger combing her hair and wishing for a mirror. When she emerged from the tent, she found Quinlan crouched by the fire, turning strips of bacon in a pan. He looked up when he heard her and nodded a greeting. "Good morning. Did you sleep well? Better than I have in weeks. You?" "Well enough." He did not elaborate, and she suspected he had not slept much at all. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw was rough with stubble. He served her bacon and toasted bread with jam he had produced from somewhere. The coffee was strong and hot, and she drank it gratefully. The snow from last night had accumulated, leaving a thin white blanket over everything, but it had stopped falling. The sky was still overcast, but it did not look threatening. They ate quickly and broke camp with practiced efficiency. Quinlan packed everything away while she helped where she could, learning the system. Within an hour they were back on the road, the horses pulling steadily through the snowy landscape. The second day of travel was harder than the first. The road climbed higher into the mountains, and the cold intensified. Snow began falling again around midday, fat flakes that quickly obscured the path ahead. Quinlan tied a scarf around his face and kept the horses moving, but she could tell he was worried. "How much further to the inn?" she asked. "We passed it 2 hours ago." She looked at him in surprise. "Why did we not stop? We were making good time, and I wanted to get as close to home as possible. But this storm is worse than I expected. We may need to find shelter soon." He did not elaborate on what that meant, but she understood. They were in the high mountains now, far from any town or settlement. If they could not find shelter, they would be trapped in the open during a blizzard. Quinlan kept the horses moving for another hour before he finally pulled off the road into a dense stand of pine trees. "There is a hunter's cabin near here," he said. "I have used it before. If we can reach it, we can wait out the storm." "How far?" "Half a mile, maybe less. But we will have to leave the wagon and go on foot. The horses can shelter in the trees." She nodded, though the thought of trudging through snow in a blizzard terrified her. But she trusted him, and she had no better option. They unhitched the horses and hobbled them in a spot where the trees provided some protection from the wind. Quinlan pulled supplies from the wagon, packing them into a large leather bag he slung over his back. He handed her a smaller bag. "Just clothes and food. Leave everything else." She repacked her things quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold despite the gloves. When she was ready, Quinlan took her hand in his. "Stay close to me," he said. "Do not let go. If we get separated in this, we may not find each other again." The seriousness in his tone frightened her, but she nodded. His hand was large and strong around hers, and she held on tight as they set off into the storm. The wind was brutal, cutting through her coat and dress like they were made of paper. Snow stung her face and blinded her. She kept her head down and focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trusting Quinlan to lead them true. It felt like they walked for hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes. Her legs burned with effort and her lungs ached from the cold air. Just when she thought she could not go on, Quinlan pulled her forward and she stumbled into the lee of a building. The hunter's cabin was small and rough, barely more than a shack, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Quinlan forced the door open and pulled her inside. The interior was dim and smelled of old smoke and animal fur, but it was out of the wind. He dropped the bag and immediately went to the small stone fireplace in the corner. There was wood stacked beside it, old and dry. Within minutes, he had a fire going and the temperature began to rise. Lorelei collapsed onto a rough bench, her whole body shaking. Quinlan came to her and began removing her wet outer layers, his movements brisk and efficient. "We need to get you warm," he said. "Frostbite is a real danger." He wrapped her in dry blankets from his bag and sat her as close to the fire as was safe. Then he tended to himself, changing into dry clothes and hanging the wet ones on pegs to dry. The cabin had only one room, with a sleeping platform built into one corner and a rough table and bench. There was a single small window, its shutters banging in the wind. Quinlan secured the shutters and then pulled supplies from his bag. More food, the pot for making tea candles. He set about making them a hot meal, all the while checking on her to make sure she was warming up. "How did you know this place was here?" she asked, when she could finally speak without her teeth chattering. "I have trapped these mountains for years. I know every cabin and shelter for 20 miles. This one belonged to an old man named Jed. He died 2 winters ago, but trappers still use the cabin when they need it. There is an unwritten rule in these mountains. Any shelter can be used by anyone who needs it, as long as you leave it as you found it and replace any supplies you use. That seems like a good rule. It has saved my life more than once." The stew he made was simple but hot, and she ate gratefully. The fire and the food and the shelter all worked together to restore her, and soon she felt almost human again. Outside, the storm raged. The wind howled like a living thing and snow piled against the walls. It was clear they would be here for a while. "I am sorry," Quinlan said as they sat by the fire after eating. "I should have stopped at the inn. I pushed too hard. You could not have known the storm would be this bad. I should have been more careful. You could have been hurt." She reached out and touched his arm. "But I was not. You got us to safety. You kept your promise to protect me." He covered her hand with his, and for a moment they stayed like that, connected, the fire warm between them. Then he pulled away and stood. "You should rest. I will keep the fire going." The sleeping platform had a thin mattress stuffed with straw, and Quinlan piled it with all the blankets they had. There was only one bed, which presented an obvious problem. Lorelei solved it by settling on one side of the mattress and looking at him expectantly. "There is only one bed," she said, "and it is cold. We will both freeze if we try to sleep separately. You said you would not force yourself on me, and I believe you. So come to bed, Quinlan. We are both adults and it is practical." He hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. Finally, practicality won. He removed his boots and lay down on the far edge of the mattress, as far from her as possible without falling off. She smiled into the darkness and pulled the blankets up to her chin. "Good night, Quinlan." "Good night, Lorelei." She fell asleep to the sound of his breathing and the howl of the wind, feeling safer than she had any right to feel. When she woke, it was fully dark and the fire had burned low. She could hear Quinlan moving around, adding wood, and the flames leaped back to life. The storm was still raging outside, perhaps even worse than before. "What time is it?" she asked sleepily. "Near midnight, I think. The storm shows no sign of stopping. We may be here for a day or two." A day or two trapped in a tiny cabin with Quinlan Winters. The thought should have worried her, but instead she felt oddly pleased. "Then we will make the best of it." She got up and helped him prepare a late-night meal of bread and cheese and some dried apples. They sat by the fire and ate, and she found herself studying him in the flickering light. He was a handsome man, she realized, not in the polished way of town gentlemen, but in a rough, elemental way. His face was all strong lines and hard planes, his body lean and powerful. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with surprising grace. "Tell me about your cabin," she said. "The one we are going to." His face softened. "It is nothing fancy. One large room with a loft for sleeping, a stone fireplace that draws well. The walls are thick, made of logs I cut myself. There are 2 windows with real glass, which cost me a month's wages, but they let in good light. The roof is sound, does not leak even in heavy rain. There is a porch where you can sit in summer and watch the sunset. A barn for the horses and any other livestock. A good well with sweet water. 20 acres of land, most of it forested, but there is a clearing where I have a garden in summer. It sounds wonderful. It is home." He stared into the fire. "I built it after Sarah died. I could not stay in the valley where I grew up, too many memories. I came up here and found this spot and knew it was right. I have been there 5 years now. It is a solitary life, but I have never minded being alone. Will you mind having company?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, his gray eyes intense. "No. I think I will like having company very much." Something passed between them in that moment, something warm and tentative and full of possibility. Lorelei felt her heart beat faster. This man, this stranger who had saved her, was becoming something more. She was beginning to care for him, to want to know him better, to imagine a future that might include more than just shared shelter. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. They talked late into the night, sharing stories from their pasts. He told her about growing up on a ranch, learning to ride before he could walk, the freedom of the open plains. She told him about life on the farm in Ohio, her mother's gentleness, her father's strictness, the loneliness of being the only girl among rough brothers. Eventually they returned to the bed, lying side by side in the darkness. This time, Quinlan did not stay on the far edge. They lay facing each other, and she could feel the warmth of his body even though they did not touch. "Lorelei," he said softly. "Yes, I am glad you are here." "I am glad it was you." "So am I," she whispered. She felt him reach out in the darkness, his fingers finding hers, tangling with them. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, a bridge between them that neither wanted to break. The storm blew itself out by morning. They woke to brilliant sunshine glittering off fresh snow, the world transformed into something clean and new. Quinlan pushed open the door and they stood on the threshold, marveling at the beauty. "We should be able to reach the cabin by nightfall," he said, "if we leave soon." They packed up quickly, making sure to leave the cabin as they had found it. Quinlan even left some of their food supplies to replace what they had used. Then they set off back to the wagon, their path from yesterday already filled in with new snow. The horses were exactly where they had left them, huddled together for warmth but otherwise fine. Quinlan checked them over carefully before hitching them back to the wagon. The road was nearly impassable, but the horses were strong and Quinlan was determined. They moved slowly, breaking trail through the deep snow, but they moved. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of white landscape and cold air. But now there was a new ease between them. They talked and laughed, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence. Lorelei found herself watching him, admiring the capable way he handled the horses, the gentle way he spoke to them, the strength in his arms as he guided the wagon. As the sun began to set, they crested a ridge, and there below them, nestled in a valley between mountains, was the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, which confused Lorelei until she remembered what Quinlan had said about the unwritten rules of the mountains. Someone must have taken shelter there. But as they drew closer, she saw that the smoke was coming from a small fire in the yard, not the chimney. And the figure tending the fire was not a stranger. "James," Quinlan called, genuine pleasure in his voice. A man looked up from the fire, his weathered face breaking into a grin. He was older than Quinlan, perhaps 40, with gray threading through his dark hair and beard. "About time you got back," he called. "I was starting to worry." Quinlan pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, clasping the other man in a brief, hard embrace. "What are you doing here? Heard you went down to Ogden and did not come back. Figured you might need help getting settled for winter." James's eyes moved to Lorelei, curious but not unkind. "And I see you did not come back alone." Quinlan helped Lorelei down and brought her forward. "James, this is Lorelei Andrews, my wife." "Lorelei, this is James Callahan, my closest neighbor and best friend." Wife. He had called her his wife. Legally, she supposed she was, but hearing him say it made it real in a way it had not been before. James removed his hat respectfully. "Madam, it is a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you," she managed. "James has a cabin about 5 miles north of here," Quinlan explained. "He is one of the few people who knows these mountains better than I do." "That is a bold claim," James said, but he was smiling. "Come on, I have stew cooking and I am sure you are both frozen. Let's get you inside." The cabin was just as Quinlan had described, and somehow even better. The interior was warm and welcoming, with sturdy furniture and braided rugs on the floor. The fireplace was large, built of river stone, and a fire crackled merrily within it. The loft above was accessed by a ladder, and she could see the edge of a large bed up there. James served them stew from the pot hanging in the fireplace, and they sat at the table to eat. She learned that James was a widower who had come to the mountains 10 years ago to escape memories of his own. He trapped and hunted, and occasionally guided city folk who wanted to experience the wilderness. "So how did you two meet?" James asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Quinlan glanced at Lorelei and she saw the question in his eyes. How much should they share? She made the decision for him. "I was recently widowed," she said simply. "Quinlan helped me when I needed it most. We married quickly, perhaps too quickly by some standards, but it felt right." It was not quite the truth, but it was not a lie either. James seemed satisfied with the answer and the conversation moved on to other topics. By the time they finished eating, Lorelei was struggling to keep her eyes open. "I should go," James said, standing. "Let you two settle in. But Quinlan, if you need anything, you know where to find me." "Thank you, James, for everything." After James left, the cabin felt suddenly small and intimate. Quinlan banked the fire and checked the doors and windows, doing the evening chores that were clearly routine for him. Lorelei stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do. "You take the loft," Quinlan said without looking at her. "I will sleep down here by the fire." "Quinlan, no, that is your bed. I cannot take it from you. You are not taking anything. I am giving it. Please, Lorelei, let me do this." She wanted to argue, but she was too tired. "Thank you," she whispered. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found a large, comfortable bed piled with quilts. There was even a basin with water for washing, and she used it gratefully before crawling under the covers. From up here she could see down into the main room, could see Quinlan spreading blankets by the fire. "Good night, Quinlan," she called softly. "Good night, Lorelei." She lay in the darkness, staring up at the rough wood of the ceiling, and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 5 days ago she had been alone and desperate. Now she was in a beautiful cabin in the mountains, married to a man she barely knew but was beginning to care for deeply. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Quinlan woke early and tended to the horses and the other chores. Lorelei would wake to the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking. They would eat together, and then the day would unfold. Sometimes Quinlan would go hunting or check his trap lines, and she would stay at the cabin, learning its rhythms and spaces. Other times they worked together, hauling water, chopping wood, repairing things that needed fixing. He was teaching her, she realized. Teaching her how to survive in this place, how to be self-sufficient. He showed her how to shoot his rifle, how to skin and butcher a rabbit, how to read the weather in the clouds. She taught him reading from the few books he had, simple texts that he stumbled over at first but gradually mastered. They were careful with each other, polite and respectful. He never touched her unless necessary, never pushed for more than she offered. At night, she slept in the loft and he slept by the fire, and neither of them acknowledged the growing tension between them, because there was tension. She felt it every time their hands brushed as he passed her a cup of coffee. Every time she watched him chop wood, his muscles moving beneath his shirt. Every time he looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, she was falling in love with him. She had not meant to, had not planned to, but how could she not? He was kind and patient and strong. He made her laugh with dry observations about the world. He listened when she talked, really listened as if her words mattered. He respected her, treated her as an equal, never made her feel lesser or stupid or weak. And she thought, hoped, that maybe he felt the same way about her. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, saw the way his jaw tightened when she smiled at him, the way his hands clenched when she stood too close. But neither of them did anything about it. They were trapped in the promise he had made that first day. He would not force himself on her. She would have to choose it. And she was terrified to make that choice, terrified of what it would mean, terrified of being vulnerable again. Christmas came and went quietly. Quinlan surprised her with a gift, a beautiful carved wooden box he had made himself. Inside was a silver locket, simple but lovely. "It was my mother's," he said as she held it reverently. "I want you to have it." "I cannot take this," she protested. "It is too precious. It should belong to someone who will treasure it. Please, Lorelei, let me give you this." She let him fasten it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. She wished she had something to give him in return, but she had nothing. So instead, she stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek, just a brief press of her lips against his stubbled jaw. He went very still, his breath catching. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark and intense. For a moment she thought he would kiss her properly, thought he would close the distance between them and finally break through the wall they had built. But he did not. He just touched her cheek gently and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Lorelei. Merry Christmas, Quinlan." January arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. They were truly snowed in now, the cabin a small island of warmth in a frozen world. There was nothing to do but tend to basic needs and wait for spring. It should have been boring, even suffocating. Instead, Lorelei found herself happier than she could remember being. They talked endlessly, learning each other's histories, hopes, fears. He told her about his childhood, about his father who had died the year after Sarah, about the ranch they had lost. She told him about her mother, who had loved poetry and flowers, about the brother who had been kind to her and the ones who had not, about Thomas, and the disappointment of a marriage born of necessity rather than love. "You regret it?" Quinlan asked one night as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside. "Marrying Thomas. I regret that he did not trust me enough to tell me about the debts. I regret that I did not have a choice in my fate after he died. But I do not regret coming west. If I had stayed in Ohio, I never would have been at that auction. I never would have met you." He was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that meeting you is the best thing that has ever happened to me." Her heart stuttered in her chest. "Quinlan, I know I promised not to pressure you. I know you need time, but I want you to know how I feel. I am falling in love with you, Lorelei. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing on that platform, so brave even though you were terrified. I want a real marriage with you if you will have me, but only if you want it too, only if you feel the same." She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I do feel the same," she whispered. "I love you, Quinlan. I did not mean to, I did not plan to, but I do." He reached for her then, pulling her into his arms, and she went willingly. His kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid she would pull away. But she did not pull away. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her mouth opening under his. He groaned and deepened the kiss, one hand tangling in her hair, the other wrapping around her waist. She had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such passion and tenderness combined. It felt like coming home. It felt like finally being where she was supposed to be. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I need you to be sure." "I am sure," she said firmly. "I want this. I want you." He swept her up into his arms, making her gasp and laugh, and carried her to the ladder. She climbed up to the loft, and he followed, and there in the darkness, with the wind singing outside and the fire glowing below, they came together as husband and wife in truth. He was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she was ready. There was some pain, for it had been years since Thomas and she was out of practice, but Quinlan was so careful, so tender, that the pain quickly gave way to pleasure. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the quilts, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I love you too," she whispered back. They slept together that night and every night after, wrapped in each other's arms, finally whole. The winter passed in a haze of happiness. They were cut off from the world, alone in their mountain sanctuary, and it was perfect. They made love and talked and laughed and dreamed about the future. Quinlan taught her to play cards and checkers. She taught him to read poetry, stumbling over the words together until they got them right. James visited once more before the worst of the winter set in, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. If he noticed the change between them, the new easiness and intimacy, he said nothing. But he smiled when he said goodbye, and Lorelei thought he was pleased for them. February brought a thaw, brief but welcome. The snow melted enough that Quinlan could check his trap lines and hunt more easily. He brought home deer and rabbits, and Lorelei learned to prepare the meat, smoking it and preserving it for later. She found she enjoyed the work, enjoyed the feeling of contributing to their survival. March arrived with the first hints of spring. The days grew longer, the sun warmer. Buds appeared on the trees, and the stream that ran near the cabin began to flow again, ice breaking up and rushing away. Quinlan began planning for the garden, sketching out what they would plant, where each crop would go. "We will need to go to town in a few weeks," he said one evening, "to buy seeds and other supplies, and to let people know we are still alive." She tensed at the thought of leaving their sanctuary, of facing the outside world again, but she knew it was necessary. They could not hide away forever. "Will we go to Ogden?" she asked. "No. There is a smaller town, Millville, about a day's ride from here, closer and friendlier. I buy my supplies there usually." "All right." When the time came to make the journey, Lorelei found she was almost excited. The cabin had been wonderful, but she was ready to see other people, to feel like part of the world again. They loaded the wagon with furs Quinlan had trapped over the winter, valuable pelts that would trade well. The road to Millville was muddy and difficult, but passable. They traveled slowly, camping one night under the stars. Lorelei lay in Quinlan's arms under a blanket, staring up at the vast expanse of sky, and felt a peace she had never known before. Millville was small, barely more than a crossroads with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of houses. But the people were friendly, greeting Quinlan with warmth and Lorelei with curiosity. "So you finally found yourself a wife," the storekeeper said, a round woman named Mrs. Patterson. "I had almost given up hope for you, Quinlan Winters." "I am a lucky man," Quinlan said, his hand finding Lorelei's. They traded the furs for supplies, seeds for the garden, flour and sugar and coffee, fabric for new dresses, needles and thread. Mrs. Patterson included a jar of honey as a wedding gift, and the blacksmith refused payment for sharpening Quinlan's knives. On the way back to the cabin, Quinlan was quiet. Lorelei finally asked what was wrong. "I am thinking about the future," he said, "about what we will do. The furs were good this year, but trapping alone will not be enough to build a real life. I want more for us. I want to buy more land, build a proper ranch, raise horses again like I did before Sarah died." "That sounds wonderful. It will take money, a lot of money. I have been thinking I could hire out to some of the ranches in the area, at least for the summer. Save up what I earn, but that would mean leaving you alone at the cabin for weeks at a time." She considered this. The thought of being alone was frightening, but not as frightening as it would have been a few months ago. She was stronger now, more capable. She could handle the cabin and the animals on her own. "We will do what we need to do," she said firmly. "If you need to work away, then you work away. I will be fine." He looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. How did I get so lucky? I ask myself the same question every day. Spring unfurled in earnest when they returned to the cabin. Quinlan plowed the garden plot and Lorelei planted the seeds they had bought. She tended the growing plants carefully, watering and weeding, watching with delight as tiny green shoots pushed through the soil. In May, Quinlan left to work at her ranch 40 miles away. He would be gone for 6 weeks, helping with the spring cattle drive. Lorelei stood at the cabin door and watched him ride away, her heart heavy but her determination strong. She could do this. She would do this. The first few days were the hardest. The cabin felt too big and too quiet without him. But she kept herself busy, tending the garden, caring for the animals, practicing her shooting so she would be ready if danger came. James stopped by once to check on her, bringing fresh game and staying for supper. He seemed impressed by how well she was managing. "Quinlan did well when he found you," he said as he left. "You are strong. He needs that." The weeks passed slowly, but they passed. The garden flourished. The weather grew warmer. And finally, gloriously, Quinlan came home. She was working in the garden when she heard the horse. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw him riding up the path. She dropped her hoe and ran, heedless of the mud on her skirts, and he swung down from the saddle and caught her up in his arms. They kissed desperately, hungrily, and she tasted salt and realized she was crying. "I missed you," she said against his mouth. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too. God, Lorelei, I thought about you every moment." They made love that night with an intensity born of separation, relearning each other's bodies, reassuring themselves that they were together again. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together, Quinlan told her about the drive, the work, the money he had earned. "It is enough to buy 10 more acres adjacent to our land," he said. "And 2 breeding mares I heard about, good stock from a ranch that is selling out. We can start building something real, Lorelei, a future." "We already have a future," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. "And it is going to get bigger in about 7 months." He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. "You are with child?" "Yes." "I realized about 2 weeks ago I wanted to tell you in person." "A baby," he breathed. We are going to have a baby." She watched the emotions play across his face: shock, joy, fear, love. Finally, he pulled her close and buried his face in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this gift. We made this baby together," she reminded him gently. "You are as much a part of this as I am." He placed his hand on her still, flat stomach, and she covered it with hers. They lay like that for a long time, planning a future that now included not just the two of them, but three. The summer was busy. Quinlan did not take any more work away from the cabin, determined to stay close as her pregnancy progressed. They bought the additional land and the mares, and he began building a larger barn to house them. The garden produced abundantly, and Lorelei spent long days preserving food for the winter. Her belly grew slowly at first, then more rapidly. Quinlan was endlessly fascinated by the changes in her body, gently touching her stomach, marveling when the baby began to kick. He built a cradle from pine wood, carving it with intricate designs of horses and mountains. Mrs. Patterson, when they made another trip to Millville in August, gave them baby clothes and blankets, along with advice about childbirth that made Lorelei both grateful and terrified. In September, James brought his sister-in-law Mary to visit. Mary was a midwife who had delivered dozens of babies. She examined Lorelei and pronounced her healthy and strong. "The baby should come in late December or early January," Mary said. "I will come stay with you a few weeks before, to make sure I am here when the time comes." "Thank you," Lorelei said, squeezing the older woman's hand. The thought of giving birth in the isolated cabin had terrified her, but knowing Mary would be there eased her fears. The leaves turned gold and red, and the air grew crisp. They harvested the last of the garden and laid in supplies for winter. The mares were settling in well, and Quinlan was already planning to breed them come spring. Everything was falling into place. December arrived, cold and clear. Mary came as promised, settling into the cabin and taking over many of the household chores so Lorelei could rest. The baby sat heavy and low now, and she was uncomfortable most of the time. But she was also happy, anticipating the moment when she would finally meet the child she and Quinlan had created. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Quinlan had bid everything he had to save her from a fate worse than death, the pains began. Mary took charge immediately, sending Quinlan to fetch water and build up the fire, and then banishing him to the barn to wait. "This is woman's work," she said firmly when he protested. "You will only be in the way." The labor was long and hard. Lorelei had never experienced pain like this, pain that came in waves, building and cresting and then receding only to build again. Mary coached her through it, telling her when to push and when to rest, wiping her forehead with cool cloths. Sometime near dawn, when Lorelei thought she could not take any more, Mary said, "One more push. Give me one more good push." Lorelei bore down with everything she had, and suddenly there was a release and then a cry. A thin, reedy wail that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "It is a boy," Mary said, holding up a tiny, red, squalling infant. "A perfect, healthy boy." Lorelei held out her arms and Mary placed the baby on her chest. He was so small, so fragile, but so beautiful. She counted his fingers and toes, marveling at the tiny nails, the rosebud mouth, the dark hair plastered to his head. "Someone wants to meet his father," Mary said, smiling. She went to the door and called out, and moments later Quinlan burst in, his face pale with worry. "Lorelei, are you all right?" "I am perfect," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Come meet your son." He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby in her arms. His expression was one of pure wonder. "He is so small." "He is perfect," she corrected. "Just perfect." Quinlan touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and the infant's fingers curled around it instinctively. The look on Quinlan's face in that moment, of absolute love and awe, was something Lorelei knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "What will we name him?" Quinlan asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything. Now, though, looking at her husband holding their son with such tenderness, Lorelei knew. "Thomas," she said, "for my first husband who brought me west, and James for the friend who has stood by us. Thomas James Winters." "Thomas James Winters," Quinlan repeated, testing the name. He smiled. "It is perfect. He is perfect. You are perfect." He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Lorelei felt complete in a way she never had before. She had been auctioned off like property, had married a stranger out of desperation, but somehow, impossibly, she had found love. Real love. The kind of love that built a life, that weathered storms, that created new life. Mary stayed for another week, making sure both Lorelei and the baby were healthy and strong. When she finally left, it was with promises to return in the spring. James came to visit, bringing gifts for the baby and congratulations for the parents. "He looks just like you, Quinlan," James said, peering at the infant sleeping in his cradle. "Poor child," Quinlan replied, but he was smiling. The winter that followed was the happiest of Lorelei's life. Despite the cold and the isolation, despite the sleepless nights and the constant demands of a newborn, she had never been more content. Quinlan was a devoted father, helping with Thomas whenever he could, walking the floor with him when he cried, changing his diapers without complaint. They worked as a team, supporting each other, loving each other. And little Thomas thrived, growing stronger and healthier every day. Spring came again, bringing with it new possibilities. The mares were bred to a stallion James knew, and by summer they would have foals. The garden was planted again, bigger this time. Quinlan took on some more work, hiring out his skills as a horse trainer to nearby ranches, but he was never gone more than a few days at a time. Thomas learned to smile and then to laugh, delighted by everything around him. He was a happy baby, content to watch his parents work, to be carried in a sling on Lorelei's back as she tended the garden. By the time Thomas was a year old, the ranch was beginning to prosper. They had 3 horses now, with 2 foals on the way. The garden produced enough to feed them and to trade in Millville. Quinlan's reputation as a horse trainer was growing, and men came from miles around to seek his services. They were not rich, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with Thomas asleep in Lorelei's arms, Quinlan took her hand. "You ever think about that day in Ogden?" he asked. "The auction?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to someone else. I think about it often, about how close I came to not being there. If I had left Ogden a day earlier, if I had not been in the mercantile when those men were talking, you would have been bought by someone else, someone who would not have treated you well." She shuddered at the thought. "But you were there. You saved me." "No," he said, turning to face her. "You saved me. I was just surviving before you came into my life. Now I am living. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something permanent. You gave me a family. I should be thanking you." "Then we saved each other," she said, leaning in to kiss him. "That seems fair." He kissed her back, slow and deep, and Thomas stirred in her arms, making a small sound of protest at being squished between them. They broke apart, laughing, and Quinlan took the baby from her, holding him up to see the last rays of the setting sun. "This is your home, Thomas," he said softly. "This land, these mountains. Your mother and I built this for you and for any brothers or sisters who come after you. We built it with love, and we will teach you to care for it the same way." Lorelei stood and wrapped her arms around both of them, her husband and her son, and looked out at the valley spread below. The cabin they had built together, the barn and the corrals, the garden already showing green shoots, the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. It was not much by some standards, but it was theirs. Built with their hands, sustained by their labor, blessed by their love. She thought about the woman she had been a year and a half ago, standing on that auction platform in the bitter December cold, certain her life was over. That woman could never have imagined this, could never have dreamed that such happiness was possible. But Quinlan had whispered to her that day after he won the bidding, after he paid her debts. He had leaned close, his voice rough with emotion, and said, "You are coming home." At the time, she had not understood what he meant. She had thought he meant his cabin, his land. But now she knew better. Home was not a place. Home was this. Quinlan's arms around her, their son between them, the future stretching out bright and full of promise. She had come home that December day, and she had been building it ever since. 2 years later, on another December day, Lorelei stood in the same place, but everything was different. Thomas was 3 now, running wild through the snow with a stick he pretended was a horse. The ranch had grown, with 8 horses now and plans for more. The cabin had been expanded with an additional room for the children. Children, plural, because Lorelei was pregnant again, 6 months along and showing it. This baby seemed bigger than Thomas had been, more active, constantly kicking and rolling. Quinlan was convinced it was another boy. She thought it might be a girl. They argued about it playfully, making bets they knew they would not collect on. The front door opened and Quinlan emerged, carrying a large bundle wrapped in canvas. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. They had decided to throw a Christmas party, to thank the people who had helped them over the past years. James and Mary were coming, of course, along with several other neighbors she had befriended. Mrs. Patterson from Millville and her husband. Even the minister from the church they attended when weather permitted. The party was a success. Their home filled with laughter and warmth, the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread, the sound of fiddle music as one of the neighbors played. Thomas was passed from person to person, soaking up the attention. Lorelei moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had food and drink, accepting congratulations on the coming baby. At one point, she found herself standing next to Mary, both of them watching Quinlan play with Thomas. "You did well, my dear," Mary said softly. "When I first met you, you were so uncertain, so frightened. Look at you now, strong and confident with a family and a home." "I had help," Lorelei replied. "From you, from James, from Quinlan most of all. Quinlan provided the opportunity. But you did the work. Never forget that." Later, after the guests had left and Thomas was asleep in his bed, Lorelei and Quinlan sat by the fire. She was exhausted but happy, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "That was a good party," Quinlan said, pulling her close. "It was. I am glad we did it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. Finally, Quinlan spoke. "I have been thinking about expanding the operation. There is a valley about 10 miles from here, good grazing land. The owner died last year and his widow is looking to sell. I think we could afford it if we are careful. You want to buy more land. I want to build something big, something we can pass down to Thomas and this baby and any others we have. A real legacy." She turned to look at him, seeing the determination in his face. This was the man who had sold everything to save her, who had built a life from nothing through sheer will and hard work. If he said they could do it, they could do it. "Then let us do it," she said. He grinned and kissed her soundly. "I love you, Lorelei Winters." "I love you too, Quinlan Winters." The baby arrived in March in the midst of a spring storm. Mary was there again, guiding Lorelei through the process. This birth was faster than the first, but no less intense. And when it was over, Mary held up a squalling infant and announced, "It is a girl. A beautiful, perfect girl." Quinlan, who had been pacing outside despite the rain, burst in at Mary's call. He looked at his daughter, tiny and red-faced and furious at being born, and Lorelei saw tears in his eyes. "A daughter," he whispered. "I have a daughter." They named her Sarah, for the sister Quinlan had loved and lost. Sarah Grace Winters, born during a storm and destined to be every bit as fierce as the weather that marked her arrival. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly. Lorelei watched her small family with a full heart, marveling at how much her life had changed. The years flowed on, each bringing new challenges and new joys. They bought the valley land and expanded the ranch. The horses bred well, and Quinlan's reputation grew. People came from across the territory to buy horses from Winters' ranch. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses as much as his father did. Sarah was wild and fearless, climbing trees and riding before she could barely walk. 2 years after Sarah came another son, Jacob, quiet and sweet-natured. And 2 years after that, another daughter, Rachel, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn determination. The cabin grew with the family, rooms added until it was more house than cabin. They hired help, men to work the horses and women to help with the house and children. But Lorelei and Quinlan never forgot where they started, never took their good fortune for granted. Every December, on the anniversary of the auction, they took time to be alone, to remember and give thanks. Quinlan would hold her close and whisper, "You came home with me." And she would whisper back, "Best decision I ever made." When Thomas was 15, tall and strong like his father, he asked about how his parents met. Lorelei and Quinlan exchanged glances, and then together they told him the story. About the auction, about the strangers who became husband and wife, about the journey to the cabin and the slow building of love. Thomas listened with wide eyes. "So Father saved you," he said when they finished. "We saved each other," Lorelei corrected gently. "I was in a desperate situation and your father helped me, but I helped him too in ways he needed. That is what marriage should be, two people making each other stronger." "Will I find someone like that someday?" Thomas asked. Quinlan put a hand on his son's shoulder. "If you are lucky, and if you are brave enough to take a chance when it is offered, then yes. You will find someone." The children grew, and eventually Thomas met a girl from a neighboring ranch. Sarah decided she wanted to train horses like her father. Jacob surprised them all by developing a talent for growing things, taking over the garden and expanding it into a real truck farm. Rachel announced at 10 years old that she was going to be a doctor, and no one doubted her. Lorelei and Quinlan grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies showing the wear of hard work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Quinlan took her back to Ogden. She had not been there since the day of the auction, had never wanted to return. But he insisted, and she trusted him enough to go. They stood in the town square in the spot where the auction platform had been erected. It was gone now, torn down years ago. But Lorelei could still remember exactly how it felt to stand there, cold and frightened and alone. "I wanted to bring you back here," Quinlan said, "to show you how far we have come. You stood here thinking your life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." She leaned against him, his arm solid around her shoulders. "I was so scared that day. I know, but you were also brave, braver than you knew. And you were my hero." He shook his head. "I was just a man who could not stand by and watch an injustice. You are the hero, Lorelei. You took a terrible situation and turned it into something beautiful. You built a home, raised children, created a legacy. That takes real courage." She turned to face him, This man who had given up everything for her, who had loved her with such fierce devotion for 20 years. His face was lined now, his hair more gray than dark, but his eyes were the same storm cloud gray, and when he looked at her, she saw the same love she had seen all those years ago. "I love you," she said. "I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that too." "And I love you," he replied. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They kissed there in the town square, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a life beyond anything either had dreamed possible. When they returned to the ranch, their children had organized a surprise party. Friends and neighbors filled the house, celebrating 20 years of marriage. There was food and music and dancing, and Lorelei danced with Quinlan just as they had danced at their very first Christmas party. "Thank you," she whispered as they swayed together. "For what? For bidding everything on me, for whispering that I was coming home, for keeping every promise you ever made." He pulled her closer. "Thank you for trusting me, for loving me, for making me a father, for building this life with me." "It has been a good life," she said. "The best life," he agreed. They danced until their feet hurt, and then they sat on the porch with their children and grandchildren gathering around them. Thomas had married and had 2 children of his own now, and there was talk of Sarah getting engaged to the blacksmith's son. The family was growing, spreading, becoming something bigger than just Quinlan and Lorelei, but it all started with them. With a desperate widow on an auction block and a cowboy who could not stand by and watch her suffer. With a whispered promise, "You are coming home." And she had. She had come home that cold December day, and she had never left. This was her home, these mountains, this ranch, this family. Built on love and sacrifice, and the courage to take a chance on a stranger. Years later, when they were old and their children were grown with children of their own, Lorelei and Quinlan would sit on that same porch and watch the sunset. They would hold hands, their fingers intertwined, and marvel at the life they had built. "Any regrets?" Quinlan would ask, as he did every year on their anniversary. "Not a single one," she would always reply, and it was true. Despite the hard times, the struggles, the sorrows that came with any long life, she had no regrets. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had raised children who were good and strong. She had built something that would last long after she was gone. On a cold December morning many years after that auction, Lorelei Winters passed away peacefully in her sleep, her hand still clasped in Quinlan's. She was 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Quinlan followed her 6 months later, his heart finally giving out. They said he died of a broken heart, that he could not bear to be without her. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large pine tree they had planted together in their first year. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations. Thomas took it over, and then his son after him. The Winters name became synonymous with quality horses and fair dealing. People would come from hundreds of miles away to buy horses from Winters Ranch, and they would always hear the story of how it started, with a widow on an auction block in the December cold. With a cowboy who bid everything he had, with a whispered promise that changed 2 lives forever. "You are coming home." And she did. They both did, because home was not the cabin or the ranch or the land. Home was each other and the love they shared and the family they built. That was the real legacy of Lorelei and Quinlan Winters. Not the land or the horses or the money, but the love that started on a cold December day and lasted for the rest of their lives. Their great-grandchildren would stand on that hill, looking at the 2 headstones side by side, and tell the story to their own children. About the auction and the cowboy and the life that grew from an act of courage and compassion. And those children would carry the story forward, keeping alive the memory of two people who proved that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the worst days of our lives are actually the first days of something beautiful. The ranch still stands today, a testament to what two people can build when they have love and determination in each other. And on cold December nights, some say you can still hear Quinlan's voice on the wind, whispering the words that started it all. You are coming home, home to love, home to family, home to a life worth living, and that, in the end, is the greatest gift of all.